Who is this? What should he be called? What does his mother call him? What do his friends call him? What will his children, should he have any, call him? If you answered Nick Fury, you're right. He's a character from Marvel Comics, and he has appeared most recently in the movies Avengers Endgame, Captain Marvel, and Spider-Man Far From Home. And his name is Fury, not Nick. In fact, he knows someone is not who they appear to be simply because they call him Nick. It's kind of like I know anyone who calls asking for Mary is trying to sell me something. The recognition that comes with names matters, and this is a story where recognition is especially important. Both Ananias and Saul heard a voice to them from heaven. Both were surprised to hear the voice. Both heard the voice of Jesus, the risen Lord. But when Jesus called out to Saul, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Saul answered, "Who are you?" Jesus called out to Ananias, "Ananias," and he responded without hesitation, "Yes, Lord." While we recognize this story as the conversion of Saul, it is as much a story of Ananias, who knew the sound of Jesus' voice and said readily, "Yes, Lord." Saul's experience becomes the expectation for many Christian traditions, that somehow we have a moment of radical transformation. But for many of us, Ananias' experience is closer to our reality. Faithful, steady, lived so that when Jesus calls, we answer, "Yes, Lord." The preference for one is clear by how many Sauls we know. Literally, the name shows up with some regularity. From the one you better call if you're in legal trouble, to boxers and basketball players and football players and baseball players and rabbis and even a rapper or two. Saul, it seems, is everywhere. But I have never known an Ananias. Nor have I known someone named the Hebrew version Hananiah. It is one of those names relegated only to the Bible, even outside U.S. Christianity. So many names from the Bible will show up in other cultures more than they do here, but Ananias remains overshadowed by Paul, also called Saul. But it is Ananias who pulls Saul out of his wallowing into something new. It is Ananias who loves his enemy. It is Ananias who does what is right in spite of his fear. It is Ananias who carries the gospel into a place of hatred and fear, where it was needed most. It is Ananias who, in this single glimpse, bears witness to faithfulness lived out over a lifetime. Ananias knew God, and knew God's voice well enough to answer, "Yes, Lord," when God called. For most of us, it is not a moment of conversion like Saul, but years of faithful discipleship, often even being raised as a follower of Jesus. While the conversion gets the attention, I would say it is more shocking to enter into a lifetime of saying, "Yes, Lord." Here is a story of someone who also said yes in a very ordinary way. Back in 1981, Karen Olson was on her way to work as a marketing executive. She drove by the same homeless woman she saw each day on her way to work. That day, though, something about the woman moved her. So she returned later in the day with a sandwich. What Karen discovered was that the woman needed a friend as much as she needed a sandwich. The woman who occupied the street corner had a story. She wasn't just a statistic. From that encounter and others like it, Karen came to realize that many of the people she saw on the street already had most of what they needed to be independent. They just needed a little help. She also realized how many families were on the streets, families who couldn't find space in shelters, because shelters are mostly designed for either men or women and children, not families. A mother with a 16-year-old son couldn't find a place to stay unless she sent the 16-year-old to a men's shelter. A father raising a daughter had nowhere to go. Married couples usually split up. She realized, though, that her church was mostly empty through the week, as were many other churches. She gathered 11 more faith communities, synagogues and mosques as well as churches, to provide housing for families, each of which took a week of opening their worship spaces and classrooms to be used for bedrooms. That was the beginning of Interfaith Hospitality Network, now called Family Promise, founded in 1986. Networks like the first that Olson founded exist all over the country, more than 200 in total in 43 states, with more than 6,000 faith communities participating. Each year, the program helps more than 49,000 family members, 60% of them children. Of those families, more than 80% achieve lasting independence. And it really began with a person of faith giving a sandwich to someone, something that is incredibly ordinary. And here's my own story of experiencing someone's faithfulness. If you've been in my office, you may have seen a tie hanging on the wall. I've held on to it for the better part of 20 years. It was from a conference about women in ministry. I grew up in a very different tradition, one where women weren't and aren't ordained. I grew up in the conservative side of that tradition where women didn't generally speak in worship. In fact, a woman would only offer a prayer request if she did not have a husband present. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg. But I ended up at a college in the progressive side of that tradition where sometime around 2004, a few people were beginning to push the conversation about women in ministry. My Bible professor jokingly gave us all ties, since clearly that was the tool that equipped men for preaching. I held on to mine, a reminder of the many gifts he gave me. By the time of the conference, I'd had at least 4 classes with the same Bible professor. Each fall, he had about 50 college freshmen for Old Testament survey, and each spring, he had about 50 college freshmen for New Testament survey. Then a few upper division Bible classes mixed in. Every single student had to take both Old and New Testament survey for general education requirements, regardless of our major. With a captive and somewhat diverse audience, he worked in things that were subtle, but just a little nudge away from the traditions we'd been raised in. Like, Miriam was 1/3 of the leadership of the Israelites when they left Egypt, along with Aaron and Moses. She was the one who led them in worship after they crossed the Red Sea. It was there, chapter and verse, in black and white, if anyone bothered to point it out. Junia was called an apostle at the end of Romans, again, there in black and white, chapter and verse, if you looked. Most of us had grown up hearing her called Junius, the male ending of the name that came in later copies of the letter to the Romans. A woman who was an apostle seemed impossible to some later authors. I could rattle off many more things, many more seeds he planted, but mostly I'm amazed that he did what he did where he did it. Not only was it 2004 before they're really talking about women's ordination, it was at a school where the president wanted to hyphenate liberal arts just so there wouldn't be any confusion. It was dry on and off campus, and the dean of students had spies. We didn't have dances, we had formals, and even those were held off campus. Dorms were closed to the opposite gender most of the time, except for the lobby. And here was this guy, showing us things in the Bible we'd never heard before, not just women's ordination. And he did it faithfully for 30 years. I did the math. It was a small school, so 2,000 different college freshmen is a generous estimate in those 30 years. But the impact is immeasurable. I imagine that I'm only one among those 2,000 whose life took a radically different turn because of him. And so as I consider lives of faithfulness, it remains true that I've never met an Ananias. I've never met an Ananias, but I have met many a person who went out in the streets to pick up trash or to gather with homeless neighbors or to offer food and water. I've never met an Ananias, but I have met many a person who would go into a place that scared them because Jesus called them there. I've never met an Ananias, but I have seen many a person go and offer whatever healing they had, kindness or care or a ride to the hospital. And I have never met an Ananias, but I have met many a person who followed Jesus' words into places that no one else wanted to go. While I've never met someone named Ananias, it seems I have met many like him, who knew the sound of Jesus' voice so well that they said without hesitation, "Yes, Lord." It turns out faithfulness matters. And in the long run, it matters more than a conversion experience that is only a brief moment in a life of faithfulness. Blessed was Ananias who was able to recognize the voice of God and answer, "Yes, Lord." Blessed are you too, who have learned to recognize the voice of God and answer, "Yes, Lord." Amen.